Here is a purple ink by Sailor Kobe number 18. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. First looking at this ink, I was confused if it was a purple or a blue. But before we really get into this, I have to talk about the pens that are used for the writing sample. A generous viewer really nudged me at there's a need to show different pens in these reviews and sent me 3 pens in the same nib sizes I've used for previous reviews. So I will be featuring that on a bunch of reviews this year. Now, back to this ink. For me, this is too blue leaning a purple and confusing with it being blue sometimes, leaving me not enjoying it as often. It makes my heart sad a little bit because I won't use up the sample, but will bury the remnants of the sample with the cover of darkness so that it will go undisturbed. It has tone and color variation from every nib, keeping you on your toes, and the shading is very lacking, almost completely absent in most cases. It goes on this long list of inks that I'm glad I tried, and also glad I don't have a bottle of. The pen for today is a Pelikan M205. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a purple that's very blue leaning with no feather, no spread. It does offer bits of shading throughout the writing. You see it in the T of don't. You see it starts on precise as a mid-tone gets a little lighter and very dark at the end of the word. The shading can be there, and it may show itself with the soft fine nib, or soft fine with the extra fine nib here from time to time, but it being medium flow, not a ton. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. A lot darker. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does not really get confused with the color blue. It is certainly purple here with no shading for those that hate shading. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone that we get with the medium. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does not get confused with blue. So when this ink is in its darker version on nicer paper, it certainly is a purple that does not shade. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There were approximately 5 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, this is a little lighter in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine, and to me, a little bit of that blue is showing through. Not so much a purple for sure, but is it purple or blue? Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does offer little bits of shading, like you can see in the word green on the second line, starts as a mid-tone, gets darker in the middle, lighter at the end, where hood starts darker, gets lighter, and gets darker again at the D. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does not shade. It plays the purple or blue thing, more towards purple, but it could be a purple leaning blue. It's a problem for me with this ink. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is a purple here, and not a purple leaning blue. A purple with a little blue showing through. Very confusing. Fine line being drawn there. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is a great thing to see with non-fountain pen paper. This one is pretty good. It's not shading. I wouldn't expect it. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting on the stub is rather minor. On the medium and the fine, it is doing very well. You could easily write on the back of this page.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is right about the same darkness of tone as it was on the Clairfontaine. Certainly is much more of a purple tone here. Actually, I like this tone quite a bit on this paper. This might be, for me, the best tone that I get with this ink. It's being altered by the paper. Now, it's not feathering. It is not spreading. It does give spots of shading. Take a look at Mistaken. You're not mistaken. That's shading. Same with Comfort. Like, it's nice to see shading in ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. It is more purple leaning than it was on the Clairfontaine. Really a purple. Nice, dusty tone. Lighter in its darkness than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather. It does not spread. It does technically shade just a little bit. If you look at Horse compared to Lot directly underneath it, Lot is a little bit lighter. And Of to the right of that goes a little bit lighter again. So it can sometimes offer a little bit of shade. Looking at the broad nib, it is right about the same tone as the medium. Quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. A really nice dusty tone. I like the color tone, what I'm seeing with this paper. This is the only way that I've found that I really like this ink. I might dig up that sample. Probably not. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does offer a couple of moments of shading. Now, I'm going to ignore on the fourth line where I think that's some finger oils that cause the different tone of the ore. But really what we see is a darker midtone and darker tones like in the word tobacco. Looking at the back of the page, you see that ghosting is very easily under control, letting you right back here. Nothing bled through, touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. And this paper is a little bit not as pure a white. That could be the tone difference that we're really seeing here. Now, it's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is giving some nice bits of shading throughout. You see it on the end of forward on the first word. They, on the second line, starts as a midtone, gets darker at the H, lightens up at the Y. Doing a pretty good job. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine, just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, without feathering, without spread, with shading. Not a ton, just tiny bits. You see it on the T of not in the third line. Them on the first line is quite a bit darker than two directly underneath it. And on the second line, that starts darker, gets a tad bit lighter, and then very dark at the T. Looking at the broad nib, it is a tiny bit darker than it was with the medium, a tiny bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade a little bit. I was really hoping for more shading with this stub. I feel like if I was to make the stub a little bit drier, I could really do it, but I don't want to mess with the pens so that we keep something rather consistent with them. It shades some. I want more, and it's just not there. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Kaweco Summer Purple. Here is Noodler's Purple Dream. Here is Scribo Notturno Viola. Here is Waterman Tender Purple. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, just a dustier version of it. Now, it does not feather. It does not spread. It does offer some shading, though it's not shading as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It definitely has areas that are coming through and showing just a hint of personality. 4 notes. I would call it acceptable, but I would want a little bit more because I know a nice ink gets me a better grade. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. Quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There's no feathering. There is no spread. There is shading better than it did on the extra fine. Look at Never. Starts darker, works its way lighter. Heard, dark to midtone to dark. Before, dark, light, dark. It's doing its very best right here as far as the shading goes with this medium nib. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a bit darker than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, but it does bring little bits of shading. Look at Not, starts quite a bit darker. The O is a little bit lighter. 4 starts darker, gets a little lighter as it works its way through. The shading that's happening here is not anything particularly stand out. I'm trying to point out the areas where it could be most noticeable because there's so little of it. Looking at the back of the page, you see that ghosting, minimal. Bleeding, none. Performance, great.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a green ink by Elixir River Safari. Here is a gray ink by Lamy Agate. Here is a pink ink by Caran-d'Ache Divine Pink. Here is a yellow ink by Sailor Kobe number 21. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, It is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a tiny, tiny bit. It spreads just a little bit. Now, neither of those are really a problem for this on this paper. We have to consider what we're writing on. I would say this is pretty darn good for what we're seeing, though it's still not for me. It's doing fairly decent. No shading here, just a lighter purple. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, not a surprise. It does spread, not a surprise, but it spreads not quite all the way up to a broad, like a medium broad. I don't even know if anybody makes a medium broad, but this would be a medium broad. It doesn't, that just sounds so bad to say this is a medium broad. Yeah, just... It doesn't shade. It's just kind of there. Its performance overall, given the paper, I think is pretty good. Looking at the stub nib, it is a tiny bit darker than it was with the medium. It is quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, we do get feathering, of course. We do get spread, of course. Neither of them are something that should stop you from using this ink, though, because I don't think it's out of control. Now, we're not getting any kind of shading. My experience on copy paper is when inks shade, they're bleeding. So the fact that it's not shading, I'm going to call a good thing. Looking at the back of the page, you see there's ghosting. I don't know that you could write back here and be able to use the information that's there, but it did not bleed through. It did not touch the page underneath, and that is always a bonus on copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
As we're choosing pens, I have to bring attention again to the generous viewer that sent these 3 pens to be used for the writing samples. So thank you very much. I don't think you wanted your name out there, so that's why I'm not saying who it was. Thank you. I really do appreciate it. And I'm taking the nudge that you're giving me to show different pens in the writing sample. Now back to the nib and pen. The color performance isn't for me on this ink in general. That said, you can choose the pen based on the tone you exactly want. Not exactly a predictable ink in that way, but it's not horrible, just not for me. But if I had to choose, I really preferred it with the medium flow stub the most, except of course on that national brand paper.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.